At 6 in the morning on March 23, 1943, the eastern horizon over the El Guetar Valley in Tunisia split open, with the sound of 50 German tanks moving in line through the desert haze. Dust rose hundreds of feet into the cold dawn air. The ground trembled under the treads of the 10th Panzer Division. American infantry in shallow foxholes pressed their faces into the gravel and waited for the machines to roll over them. But the Germans never reached those foxholes. Within hours, 30 of those tanks were burning wrecks scattered across the valley floor, and the legend of American artillery had announced itself to the Wehrmacht for the first time. The men inside those panzers had no way to understand what had just happened. They had been hit by something that did not yet exist in any other army in the world. They had been hit by a system. This is the story of how a small group of officers at a dusty post in Oklahoma quietly built the most lethal artillery network of the 20th century, and why the German army, the army that had taught the world how to wage modern war, could never find an answer to it. To understand the storm that broke over El Guetar, you have to begin with the weapons themselves. The standard American light field piece was the 105mm howitzer, a stout, reliable gun, standardized as the M2A1. It could throw a 33-pound shell almost 7 miles. A trained crew of 8 could fire 10 rounds in a single minute and sustain 3 rounds a minute for hours. By the end of the war, more than 8,500 of these howitzers had been built. Above the 105 sat the medium 155mm howitzer, and above that, the 155mm gun, the famous Long Tom, capable of hurling a 95-pound shell more than 14 miles. Heavier still were the 8-inch howitzer and the giant 240mm howitzer that came forward when fortified targets needed to be cracked open. Together, these weapons formed a layered cone of steel that could reach from the front line all the way back into the German rear areas. But the Germans had guns too. The Wehrmacht had excellent artillery pieces, and in 1939, when the war began, German gunnery doctrine was admired around the world. The decisive American advantage was never the steel and the powder. The decisive advantage was something invisible, something built out of charts, radios, slide rules, mathematics, and trained minds. It was something the United States Army called the Fire Direction Center. The story of that center begins in a place that, on its face, had nothing to do with European battlefields. Fort Sill, Oklahoma, was a sun-baked army post on the southern plains, founded in 1869, surrounded by mesquite and red dirt. The field artillery school there had grown out of the older school of fire, established in 1911, after the First World War. While most of the United States Army was being demobilized and forgotten, a handful of officers at Fort Sill became obsessed with a problem that had bled the Western Front white from 1914 to 1918. The problem was simple to state and almost impossible to solve. When an infantry company is pinned down, when a tank attack is forming behind a ridge, how do you bring the maximum weight of artillery fire onto that exact spot in the shortest possible time? Every army of the First World War had used artillery in enormous quantities, but the fire was clumsy. It had to be planned hours or even days in advance. Once the battle began, the gunners often could not respond to what the infantry actually needed. The result was rigid, scheduled barrages that frequently fell on empty ground while real targets went unhit. In the late 1920s, a major named Carlos Brewer became director of the gunnery department at the Field Artillery School. Brewer was not a flamboyant man. He was a careful, methodical thinker, and he believed the answer to the artillery problem lay in mathematics and procedure rather than in better guns. With his colleagues, he began to design a new way of doing business. Instead of having each battery commander aim his own guns at terrain features, Brewer proposed surveying every battery position precisely, plotting them on a single chart, and then designating targets by reference to a known base point on that chart. In the spring of 1931, on the gunnery range at Fort Sill, Brewer's team did something that had never been done before in the United States Army. They massed the fire of a full battalion of howitzers onto a single target, using only the firing chart and pre-computed data. It worked. The shells fell where the chart said they would fall. A revolution had begun, but almost no one outside Fort Sill noticed. Brewer's successor, Major Orlando Ward, took the next step. Ward, who would later command the 1st Armored Division in Tunisia, formalized the idea into a physical place inside the artillery battalion. He called it the Fire Direction Center. It was a tent, or a truck, or a dugout, where a small team of officers and enlisted men sat with charts, range tables, telephones, and radios. When a request for fire came in, the center computed the firing data for every gun in every battery, all at once. The center became the brain of the battalion. The guns became its hands. His successor, Lieutenant Colonel H.L.C. Jones, refined the system further and pushed it across the entire artillery community in the late 1930s. In 1939, the graphical firing table arrived, a pre-computed slide rule that adjusted firing data for differences in range, propellant charge, and atmospheric conditions in seconds rather than minutes. Together with the firing chart, the radio, and the new doctrine, the graphical firing table gave the United States Army a tool no other army in the world possessed. Standing behind these reformers were two more senior officers who would prove decisive. From the summer of 1925 through August 31, 1929, Major Jacob Devers ran the gunnery department at Fort Sill and was credited with a number of the early innovations in fire support technique. Later, as Chief of the Armored Force from August 1941, by then a brigadier general, Devers would push for organic light aircraft inside artillery battalions, an idea that would change the war. The other patron was Lieutenant Colonel Leslie McNair, a quiet, bookish, white-haired field artillery officer who served on the staff of the Field Artillery School from 1929 to 1933. McNair believed in training, in mathematics, in standardized procedure. When he was given command of the Army Ground Forces in 1942, he became the most powerful protector the new artillery doctrine had. McNair guaranteed that the Fire Direction Center, the firing chart, and the graphical firing table were written into every field manual, taught at every training camp, and built into the table of organization of every American division. By the time Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7, 1941, the United States Army possessed, almost as a secret, the most advanced artillery fire control system in the world. The Germans, the British, the Soviets, the Japanese, none of them had anything quite like it, and almost no one outside the artillery branch understood what was about to happen. In June 1942, the War Department approved the addition of organic field artillery air observation. Each artillery battalion was authorized 2 small, unarmed liaison aircraft. The plane chosen was the Piper J-3 Cub, a tiny fabric-covered tandem trainer with a 65-horsepower engine and a cruising speed of 80 miles per hour. In military service, it was redesignated the L-4 Grasshopper. About 5,400 would be ordered. Painted olive drab, fitted with a radio in the back seat, the L-4 became the eyes of American artillery. A pilot in an L-4, flying low and slow over the front line at 1,000 or 2,000 feet, could see what no ground observer could see. He could spot a column of German tanks moving behind a ridge. He could see a battery of German artillery hidden in a wood. He could watch his own shells fall and call corrections in real time. With a single radio call, he could put the fire of dozens of guns onto whatever he saw. The other key role belonged to the man on the ground, the forward observer. Every American artillery battalion fielded forward observers who lived with the infantry, walked with the infantry, slept in the infantry's foxholes, and ate the infantry's cold rations. The forward observer carried a radio, a map, and a pair of binoculars. When the infantry needed fire, he sent a structured radio message back to the Fire Direction Center. The format was rigid and short. He identified himself, gave a warning that fire was needed, gave the target's location, described what the target was, requested the type of shell and fuse, and stated how he wanted the rounds delivered. The Fire Direction Center received the call. The plotters marked the target on the chart. The computers ran the firing data through the graphical firing table. The data flashed by phone to the gun positions. The crews set their fuses, adjusted their elevation and deflection, loaded the shells, and waited. The whole process, from the moment the forward observer pressed the button on his radio to the moment the first shells left the muzzles, could take as little as 3 minutes. But the most astonishing capability of the system was something the Americans called time on target. The technique had been developed in parallel by British gunners in North Africa in late 1941 and early 1942, but only the Americans, with their centralized fire direction centers, were able to scale it across multiple battalions and even multiple corps. The principle was elegant. Different batteries are different distances from the target, so their shells need different amounts of time to fly there. If you tell each battery exactly when to fire, all the shells from all the batteries can be made to land within the same 3-second window. The effect on the receiving end was annihilating. A soldier under normal artillery fire hears the first shells and dives for cover. The first rounds kill some men, but most survive by going prone. Under a time-on-target shoot, there is no first round. There is only one continuous, deafening, simultaneous storm of impacts, everywhere at once. United States Army studies later found that lying flat could reduce artillery casualties by up to 66%. Time on target stripped that protection away. A captured German officer described it simply as quick, powerful bursts for which there was simply no defense. The first major test of all this came in February 1943. The Germans were not idle. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had been pushed back across Libya by the British 8th Army, but in Tunisia he still commanded a dangerous force. And on February 14 he attacked the inexperienced United States Second Corps in the Kasserine Pass. The Americans were thrown back in disorder. Tanks were lost. Men panicked. Equipment was abandoned. For a week, the green American troops looked as if they might be routed entirely. What stopped the Germans was American artillery. The 9th Infantry Division Artillery, under Brigadier General Stafford Leroy Irwin, made a forced march of about 1,300 kilometers from Algeria, brought 48 howitzers into position on the night of February 21 to 22, near the village of Thala, and at dawn on February 22, opened a coordinated barrage that broke up the renewed attack of the 10th Panzer Division. It was the first major American artillery success of the war. Rommel, who had been planning to push deeper, called off the offensive. The Wehrmacht had taken its first proper measure of the new system, and it had not liked the answer. 5 weeks later came El Getar. At 6 in the morning on March 23, 1943, 50 German tanks of the 10th Panzer Division advanced through the dust toward the positions of the United States, 1st Infantry Division under Major General Terry Allen. The artillery was waiting. The 5th, 7th, 32nd and 33rd Field Artillery Battalions of the 1st Infantry Division, supported by the 5th Armoured Field Artillery Group, and the 601 Tank Destroyer Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Herschel Baker, all under the artillery command of Brigadier General Clift Andrus, opened fire. By mid-morning, the German attack had collapsed. The infantry, caught in the open, broke and ran. Brigadier General Andrus later described the scene with cold understatement, saying simply that the German battalion broke from cover and started to run for another wadi in the rear, but none ever reached it. A year and a half passed between El Getar and the great battles of Western Europe. In that time, the Americans landed in Sicily, fought their way up Italy, and on June 6, 1944, came ashore at Normandy. By the summer of 1944, the system that Brewer and Ward had drawn on chalkboards in Oklahoma was operating at a scale they could scarcely have imagined. A typical United States infantry division now contained 4 artillery battalions of its own, 3 of 105mm howitzers and 1 of 155mm howitzers, for a total of 48 tubes inside the division. Above the division sat Corps Artillery, which controlled additional battalions of 155mm long-tom guns, 8-inch howitzers, 4.5-inch guns, and the heavy 240mm pieces. A single American corps in northwest Europe could put more than 200 artillery pieces into a coordinated fire mission. By late 1944, the United States Army fielded around 49 battalions of long-tom guns alone. And still the Germans had no answer. About 80% of German artillery remained horse-drawn through 1943. In many calibers, German shell production during the Second World War never recovered to the levels of 1917 and 1918. By 1944, German artillery batteries were equipped with a hodgepodge of pieces drawn from German, French, Czech, Polish, and other captured stocks. German horse teams could move only about 25 miles per day, and only for a few days before the animals had to rest. The Wehrmacht's artillery was capable, but it was slow, fragmented, and chained to the past. It could not mass fire across multiple battalions on call. It could not concentrate the steel of a corps onto 1 acre of ground in 3 minutes. The contrast became impossible to miss in the summer of 1944. On July 25, during Operation Cobra near St. Lo, The United States First Army loaded the front of the German Panzer Lehr Division with the fire of more than 1,000 artillery pieces, plus more than 1,800 heavy bombers and several hundred medium and fighter aircraft. Major General Fritz Bayerlein, commanding Panzer Lehr, later wrote that the bombers came as if on a conveyor belt, and that the well-dug-in infantry was smashed by the heavy bombs in their foxholes and dugouts, or killed and buried by blast. The whole bombed area, he said, was transformed into fields covered with craters in which no human being was alive. That same day, in a slit trench among the men of the 2nd Battalion, 120th Infantry Regiment, of the 30th Infantry Division, Lieutenant General Leslie McNair was killed when an 8th Air Force bomb fell short. The architect of the modern American Army Ground Forces, the protector of the artillery doctrine that was at that very moment winning the battle, died because of a friendly bomb dropped in support of the breakout he had helped make possible. He was buried at the Normandy American Cemetery. He was the highest-ranking American officer killed in Europe during the war. By Act of Congress in 1954, his rank was raised posthumously to general. 2 weeks after McNair's death, the system he had championed produced the most extraordinary artillery defense of the entire war. On the night of August 6–7, 1944, by direct order of Adolf Hitler, 4 German panzer divisions launched Operation Lüttich, a counterattack at the small Norman town of Mortain, intended to cut the Allied breakout in half. The attack hit the 30th Infantry Division. The center of the American defense was a stony hilltop called Hill 314, just east of Mortain. On Hill 314, the 2nd Battalion of the 120th Infantry Regiment, around 700 men under officers, including Captain Reynold Eriksson, Captain Delmont Byrne, First Lieutenant Ralph Curley, First Lieutenant Joseph Reeser, and First Lieutenant Ronald Woody, found themselves surrounded by elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Division and the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division. The defenders included 2 artillery forward observers, First Lieutenant Charles Bartz and Second Lieutenant Robert Weiss, both attached to the 230th Field Artillery Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Louis Wieman. What followed was a 6-day demonstration of what the Fire Direction Center could do. From the hilltop, Bartz and Weiss called fire mission after fire mission. The 230th answered every call with the same 2 words on the radio, on the way. Over 6 days, the 230th alone fired more than 8,000 rounds in defense of the hill. Behind them, additional 105 and 155mm battalions of the 30th Division and 7th Corps joined in. By the high point of the battle, the surrounded infantry on Hill 314 could call on the fires of about 12.5 artillery battalions on demand. The men on the hilltop were running out of food, water, plasma, and morphine. Airdrops on August 9 and 10 missed badly, with most of the bundles falling outside the perimeter and into German hands. Lieutenant Colonel Wieman, working with the 30th Division Surgeons Section, then designed an extraordinary emergency resupply method. Propaganda smoke shells were hollowed out, packed with bandages, plasma, and morphine, and beginning on August 10, fired by artillery up onto Hill 314. Medical supplies were delivered to a surrounded battalion by way of 105mm howitzer. The German counterattack failed completely. Captured General Kurt Dittmar said after the war that the war had been lost in the West when the attack at Mortain failed. The 30th Infantry Division would later be awarded the Presidential Unit Citation for the defense of Mortain. Captains Eriksson and Byrne and Lieutenants Curley, Reeser, and Woody all received the Distinguished Service Cross. But Mortain was only the beginning of the German catastrophe in Normandy. As the Allies closed in around the retreating German 7th Army at Falaise, the trapped formations were funneled into a pocket about 6 miles deep and 7 miles wide. For more than a week, American and British artillery, with overwhelming air support, ground that pocket into a slaughterhouse. Military historian Robert Citino has observed that the level of destruction in such a concentrated area was likely unprecedented in the war. General Dwight Eisenhower, walking the ground 48 hours after the gap was closed, described scenes that he said could be described only by Dante. Fritz Bayerlein, looking back, wrote that not even the battles of 1940 in France or 1941 in Russia could approach the Battle of Annihilation in France in 1944. By October, the war reached the borders of Germany itself. The first German city to fall to American troops was Aachen, the ancient coronation seat of Charlemagne. On October 11, 1944, after warning the city to surrender, 12 American artillery battalions of the 1st Infantry Division and 7th Corps fired roughly 5,000 rounds into Aachen in a single coordinated preparation. Over the next 2 days, another 5,000 shells followed. When self-propelled 155mm guns were brought up to fire at point-blank range into reinforced apartment buildings, the German garrison began to collapse. On October 21, Colonel Gerhard Wilk surrendered the city. Then, in mid-October, the wind shifted. American troops pushed into the dark, wet, broken ground of the Hürtgen forest east of Aachen. Here, the artillery system, for the first time, met conditions in which it could not work to its full effect. The forest canopy was so dense that forward observers could not see their targets. Air observation was crippled by clouds and mist. Tree bursts caused American casualties as well as German. Over 5 months, around 120,000 Americans entered the Hürtgen forest, and around 33,000 became casualties. Ernest Hemingway, who walked those woods with Colonel Charles Lanham of the 22nd Infantry Regiment, called it Passchendaele with tree bursts. German General Hans Schmidt of the 275th Infantry Division remembered that the effect of the shells exploding in the treetops was much greater due to the falling and splintering of trees and branches. The Hürtgen was the system's worst battle. The next was its greatest. Before dawn on December 16, 1944, the Wehrmacht launched its last great offensive of the war. Hitler had assembled 3 armies and roughly 250,000 men, including the elite 6th Panzer Army under Sepp Dietrich, in the Ardennes forest in Belgium. The plan was to punch through thinly held American lines, race for the Meuse River, capture Antwerp, and split the Allied armies in half. The opening barrage thundered along an 80-mile front, caught in the path of the main effort, on a wooded ridge near the village of Elsenborn, were the Green 99th Infantry Division under Major General Walter Lauer and the veteran 2nd Infantry Division under Major General Walter Robertson. What unfolded over the next 10 days, on what would become known as the northern shoulder of the Bulge, is one of the most decisive artillery actions of the entire Second World War. The 99th Division withdrew, fighting hard, through the twin villages of Krinkelt and Rocherath, and onto the high ground at Elsenborn Ridge. There it joined the 2nd Division, the 1st Infantry Division, and the Artillery Reserve of 5th Corps under Lieutenant General Leonard Guerreau. By December 19, more than 300 American artillery pieces, including 105s, 155s, 8-inch howitzers, and 4.2-inch chemical mortars, were emplaced along Elsenborn Ridge. The 4 artillery battalions of the 99th Division alone, the 370th, the 371st, the 924th, and the 372nd, had been firing constantly. Now they were joined by the artillery of 3 other divisions and the Corps Reserve. Every approach to the ridge could be saturated with massed fire on a few minutes' notice. On December 19, the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division lost 15 assault guns and tanks in a single morning to American artillery. On December 21, another 3rd Panzer Grenadier attack was hit by artillery while still forming up, and the attack was cancelled before it began. On December 22, in support of the 26th Infantry Regiment of the 1st Infantry Division at Dom-Butgenbach, the divisional artillery fired 10,000 rounds in a single day to break up an attack by the 12th SS Panzer Division. On December 26, the 277th Volksgrenadier Division made a final, forlorn attack on the Elsenborn Ridge against units of the 99th Infantry Division. According to the official record, this attack by infantry conscripts was mowed down by artillery fire virtually at the moment of its start. The artillery concentration of an entire American Army Corps made the Elsenborn Ridge position virtually unassailable. By the time the offensive sputtered out, the 99th Infantry Division, fighting its first battle, had inflicted more than 4,000 killed and the loss of more than 60 tanks and large guns on the Germans, at a casualty ratio of about 18-1 in favor of the Americans. John Eisenhower, son of the Supreme Commander, would later write that Elsenborn Ridge was the most decisive of the Ardennes campaign. Sepp Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army, which was supposed to deliver the knockout blow of Hitler's offensive, had been broken not by tanks, not by infantry, but by gunners reading firing tables in heated tents miles behind the line. While Elsenborn held the northern shoulder, A similar story unfolded at the Belgian crossroads town of Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne Division, under acting commander Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, was surrounded for a week. The defence rested in large part on 4 artillery battalions inside the perimeter, including the 321st and 907th Glider Field Artillery Battalions, the 377th Parachute Field Artillery Battalion, and the attached 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel John Cooper, with their 75mm pack howitzers. The gunners fired in a complete circle around the entire perimeter, often switching directions within minutes, as the Germans probed first one sector and then another. When German envoys arrived on December 22 demanding the surrender of the encircled garrison, McAuliffe gave the most famous one-word reply of the entire war. The reply was simply, "Nuts." The artillery did the rest, holding the perimeter until the 4th Armoured Division of Patton's Third Army broke through to relieve the town on December 26. Even as Elsenborn was being held, a second American innovation was unleashing its full power against German troops for the first time. Since 1940, an American team led by the United States Navy and Johns Hopkins University had been developing a tiny radar device that fit inside the nose of an artillery shell. It was called the proximity fuse, or in the United States Army, the posit fuse. Inside each shell was a miniaturized radio transmitter and receiver, vacuum tubes built to survive the shock of being fired out of a cannon that detected the ground or a target, and detonated the shell at the optimum height for maximum lethality. The proximity fuse had first been used in combat on January 5, 1943, when the cruiser USS Helena shot down a Japanese dive bomber off Guadalcanal with 2 5-inch shells. It had been used over land for the first time in June 1944 against German V-1 cruise missiles attacking England, raising the kill rate from below 25% to nearly 80% by August. But its use as a ground artillery shell against enemy troops was forbidden, because the Allies feared that an unexploded fuse recovered by the Germans could allow them to copy the device and use it against Allied bombers. In mid-December 1944, with German troops pouring through the Ardennes, General Eisenhower lifted the restriction. Within days, American gunners across the front were screwing the new fuses into their shells. About 200,000 proximity-fused rounds would be fired during the Battle of the Bulge. The effect was extraordinary. Instead of detonating on impact and burying much of their lethal force in the dirt, the new shells exploded perfectly in the air above the target, raining fragments downward onto men in foxholes and trenches who had once been protected by lying flat. There was no defense against it. On the night of December 25 to 26, near Echternach on the Sauer River, a battalion of General George Patton's Third Army caught a German battalion attempting a river crossing and saturated it with shells fitted with the new fuse. Patton later wrote in a letter to Major General Levin Campbell of Army Ordnance that they had killed by actual count 702 Germans in that one shoot. He went on to say that he thought when all armies got this shell they would have to devise some new method of warfare, and that he was glad they had thought of it first. In another letter, Patton put it more bluntly. He wrote that the funny fuse won the Battle of the Bulge. Above all of this, in the cold winter sky, the small, unarmed L-4 grasshoppers continued to fly. The most famous of their pilots was Major Charles Carpenter, attached to the 4th Armoured Division of Patton's Third Army. Carpenter had taken his L-4H, serial number 43-30426, and bolted 6 bazooka rocket launchers to its wing struts. He named the airplane Rosie, the Rocketer. On September 20, 1944, at the Battle of Aracourt in Lorraine, Carpenter dove on a German armoured column and was officially credited with knocking out an armoured car and 4 tanks. By war's end, Army records credited him with 6 tanks destroyed. He was awarded the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, and the Air Medal. Carpenter told a reporter from Stars and Stripes that word must be getting around among those krauts to watch out for cubs with bazookas on them, because every time he showed up they shot with everything they had. He survived the war, was diagnosed with Hodgkin's disease, returned to teaching history at Urbana High School in Illinois, and died in 1966. The system that had been broken in by Tunisia and tempered by Normandy reached its full maturity in the final months of the war. On the night of February 23 to 24, 1945, when the United States Ninth Army crossed the Roa River into the heart of Germany, more than 2,000 artillery pieces opened a 45-minute preparation along the river line. Veterans of an 8-inch howitzer battalion later remembered that nearly every American artillery unit on the east side of the Rhine seemed to be firing at the same moment. None of them had ever seen anything like it before, and few American gunners would ever see anything like it again. It is worth pausing to ask why, after years of war, the Germans never built an answer. They were not stupid. They were not poorly led. They had brilliant artillery officers and excellent guns. The reasons their fire support could not match the American system were structural, and they ran deep. First, German artillery doctrine was decentralized. Each infantry division had its own artillery, but there was no equivalent of the American Fire Direction Center coordinating multiple battalions across a corps front. German fire missions were generally fired by single batteries, occasionally a battalion, and almost never several battalions on call. Massed, concentrated fire usually had to be planned and registered hours or days in advance. Second, the German army was not properly motorized. The image of blitzkrieg, of fast-moving panzer columns, hides the fact that the bulk of the Wehrmacht moved on foot and on horse. A horse-drawn battery could not race forward to support a fast-moving infantry attack. It could not displace quickly to escape counter-battery fire. It could not be where the gunners needed it to be when the moment came. Third, German radio communications and survey procedures were not engineered to support the kind of massed cross-battalion shoots that the American system performed routinely. German artillerymen often had to use well-known terrain features to adjust their fire. They did not have the survey-based, chart-based, base point method that allowed the Americans to compute fire data for any target instantly. Fourth, the German shell supply was thin. German shell production during World War II never matched the volume of even the British, let alone the Americans. Doctrine became driven by scarcity. A German battery commander knew he could not afford to fire 50 rounds when 10 would do. The Americans were not under that constraint. From D-Day to VE Day, official War Department records indicate American gunners in Europe fired roughly 23 million artillery rounds. Fifth, the air observation gap was enormous. German artillery had nothing comparable to the L4. The Wehrmacht had air liaison officers, but the practice of putting a small artillery spotter in a tiny plane and giving him direct radio control over multiple battalions of guns was a uniquely American refinement. By 1944, with the Luftwaffe driven out of the skies, American L4s flew almost wherever they wished, and beneath them, German movement in daylight became almost impossible. Add it all up, and the picture is clear. The Wehrmacht had the better tank. It often had the better infantry weapon. Its combat soldiers were superbly trained. But in the realm of artillery fire support, in the speed and weight of fire, the United States Army held a decisive edge from the moment the two armies first met seriously in 1943 until the war's end. The Germans understood it perfectly well. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, in his Italian and Normandy correspondence later compiled in the Rommel Papers, returned again and again to the same theme. He wrote that the Allied superiority in artillery, and even more in the air, was breaking open every defensive line he tried to hold, and that his enemy possessed an outstandingly large supply of ammunition that German batteries could not hope to match. General Hasso von Manteuffel, who commanded the 5th Panzer Army during the Bulge, told his post-war British interrogators that Allied air forces had found worthwhile targets throughout the whole area of his offensive, throttling his supply system, and that the mobility of his forces had decreased steadily and rapidly under that pressure. Captured German prisoners of the 22nd Infantry Regiment of the 4th Infantry Division, interrogated in the Hürtgen Forest on November 17, 1944, told their American questioners that the artillery had not yet caused them many casualties, but that its amount and duration demoralized them by keeping them in their bunkers and preventing them from getting food or evacuating their wounded. American soldiers of the 84th Infantry Division at Verdun, watching what they later described as the heaviest, most devastating bombardment they had ever witnessed fall on the German 16th Panzer Division, remembered that when the fire stopped, the cries for help from wounded and dying Germans carried clearly to their lines. For their part, the senior American commanders did not pretend that anything other than artillery had won the war for them on the ground. Major General Manton Eddy, who commanded the 12th Corps under Patton, was on record describing American artillery as the great American factor in winning the war and as the best in the world. General Patton himself put it more succinctly when he said he did not have to tell anyone who won the war, because they knew the artillery did. After the war, in the pages of the post-war Field Artillery Journal, General Dwight Eisenhower wrote that the speed, accuracy, and devastating power of American artillery had won confidence and admiration from the troops it supported, and inspired fear and respect in their enemy. He wrote that massed fire technique was one of the decisive factors of American ground campaigns throughout the world. War correspondent Ernie Pyle, who walked with the infantry from North Africa through France, and lived close enough to the fighting that he was eventually killed by a Japanese machine gun on the island of Iwo Jima in April 1945, wrote in his book Brave Men that the Germans feared American artillery almost more than anything else the United States Army had. The system that produced these results did not vanish at the end of the war. Fort Sill remained the home of the Field Artillery School, and the United States Army Artillery Center was consolidated there in 1946. The Brewer Ward firing chart evolved through the battalion check chart of the 1950s and 60s into the digital fire control computers of the 1970s. Today, every American artillery battalion still has a fire direction center. The mathematics are now inside silicon chips, rather than on paper slide rules, but the principle is identical. The proximity fuse, after the war, was declassified and is now standard. The L-4 Grasshopper became the L-16, then the L-19, then the helicopter, and now the unmanned aerial vehicle. The Forward Observer's Call for Fire format, with its identification, warning order, target location, target description, method of engagement, and method of fire and control, is essentially unchanged from the form taught in 1944. Modern guided artillery rounds like Excalibur, and modern tactics like multiple round simultaneous impact, in which a single gun fires several rounds at different elevations so they all land together, are direct descendants of the time-on-target idea. There is a small museum at Fort Sill, the Field Artillery Museum, where visitors can stand under the long barrel of an actual M1 Long Tom, walk past a restored Piper L4 Grasshopper, and look at the firing charts and graphical firing tables that men like Brewer and Ward built almost a century ago. Every year in the United States Army, new lieutenants of artillery study the same six-element call for fire that Lieutenant Robert Weiss radioed off Hill 314 in August 1944. There are memorial markers in Belgium on Elsenborn Ridge, in Normandy at Mortagne on Hill 314, in Tunisia at El Guettar, and in many small towns in Lorraine where shrapnel from American shells still occasionally turns up in farmers' fields. The men who built and fought this system were, in most cases, not famous. Brewer is not a household name. Few people outside the artillery branch know what Orlando Ward did at Fort Sill in the early 1930s. Charles Bartz and Robert Weiss are not on any monument in Washington. The crews of the 230th Field Artillery Battalion, who fired more than 8,000 rounds in 6 days at Mortagne and gave away their bandages in hollowed-out smoke shells, are not commemorated in any movie. Even Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American officer killed in Europe, lies in a quiet grave at Normandy among hundreds of other white crosses. What separates this story from many other war stories is that its central character is not a battle, not a hero, not even a weapon. Its central character is an idea. The idea was that mathematics, communications, and standardized procedure could give democracy a way to fight totalitarianism without trading life for life in the trenches as the previous generation had done. The idea was that the United States Army, instead of buying victory mostly with the bodies of its young men, could buy a great deal of it with steel, with chemistry, with vacuum tubes, with radio waves, and with a few hundred trained minds working in heated tents behind the front line. The cost was still immense. American gunners themselves were not exempt from the war's danger. The 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion lost 84 of its men, murdered in a snowy field at Malmedy on December 17, 1944, after their column was overrun. Forward observers walked with the infantry and died with the infantry. Liaison pilots in fabric-covered cubs were shot at by everything from rifles to anti-aircraft cannons. McNair himself was killed by a friendly bomb on the very day his system was working at maximum effect. Carpenter survived combat only to face a slow death from cancer. The war that the Fire Direction Center fought was not a clean war, but it was, more than any other major army's war effort, an industrial nation's war. It was the war of an army that believed problems could be measured, decomposed, and solved. When American soldiers in the snow at Elsenborn looked back over their shoulders and heard the deep bark of 155 and 8-inch guns answering every German attack within minutes, when the men of the 30th Division on Hill 314 heard their radios answered with the words "on the way" and knew that within 3 minutes the storm would arrive, they were experiencing something that no army in the world could match in 1944. They were experiencing the result of a quiet revolution that had begun on a parade ground in Oklahoma 15 years earlier. It is fitting that the story closes there, not in a city full of trumpets and parades, but at Fort Sill, where the artillery school still trains new gunners, where the names Brewer, Ward, Devers, and McNair are inscribed on buildings. Most cadets walk past without a second glance, and where the lessons that began in 1931 are still being passed down. The reason German soldiers in Tunisia and Normandy and the Ardennes could not stop American troops calling fire in minutes is not really a military secret. It is written on those walls. It was the Fire Direction Center, the firing chart, the graphical firing table, the radio, the forward observer, the grasshopper in the sky, the proximity fuse, and the time on target shoot. Above all, it was the willingness of a free society, in the years between 2 world wars, to think very hard about a brutal problem and to trust the answer to mathematics rather than to luck. That, in the end, is the quiet meaning of the story. The men in the panzers at Elgeta, the SS at Morton, the Volksgrenadiers walking up the slope at Elsenborn, did not lose to better tanks or braver soldiers. They lost to a network. They lost to chalk lines on a Fort Sill blackboard, drawn by men whose names they would never know, in a year before the war they would die in had even begun.